Hi fourth graders, this is Mr. Grossman, and today we're continuing with our big idea, how can government influence the way that we live? And to help us understand a little bit about how government can influence the way that we live, we're going to read the story, The Quilt, which was written by Sachi Oyama. Dressed in colonial clothes and long hoop skirts, Miss Misaka Hirata's students danced the minuet. They made yarn books and held spelling bees. Miss Hirata's fourth graders were learning the ways of colonial America in the 1700s. Now they had a very special assignment. So I want you to pause here, and we always want to, at the beginning of a story, make sure that we totally understand our introduction. And as we always note, authors are not trying to trick kids. Very frequently, authors in their introduction will introduce some characters. So think about what are the characters we've already learned about. They'll share with you a setting. So what is our setting? And they'll also remind you of some kind of rising action or a problem, something that's going to keep you engaged or keep you interested in what happens next. So pause now, identify those important parts of an introduction. Each student was to stitch his or her name with needle and thread on a square piece of cloth. Miss Hirata would take the patches and sew them together to make a large quilt like the ones made in early America. When they finished, they would have a quilt with the names of all the students. Each name had a story. The children of Miss Hirata's class spoke English, but many of their names were Japanese. Their parents had immigrated from Japan. The students themselves had been born in America, though. Most came from cities along the California coast or in the valleys. Some students came from Los Angeles, some from San Diego, others from Brawley or Fresno. Many of the students' parents were shopkeepers, many were farmers, and some were ministers. Miss Hirata's fourth graders were many miles from the homes they knew. They lived in a camp surrounded by barbed wire, watched by guards and towers. Why? Japan, the country their parents had come from, was at war with America. In 1941, Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. A Japanese attack on the west coast of the United States seemed possible. Many people thought that Japanese Americans might be loyal to Japan instead of America. They feared Japanese Americans might help Japanese forces attack the United States. Many politicians, newspaper writers, and ordinary citizens in California and other states said that Japanese Americans were dangerous. They urged the United States Army to gather all Japanese Americans in California and on the rest of the West Coast and intern them. President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave General John Lee DeWitt, the man in charge of defending the West Coast against enemy attack, permission to carry out this plan in February 1942. Soon after, Japanese Americans were ordered to leave their homes and jobs and report to an internment camp. This means that most Japanese American families had to sell their homes and almost all their possessions quickly for little money. Most lost nearly everything they had worked for. Today we recognize that interning Japanese Americans was unfair. Japanese Americans showed their loyalty to the United States in many ways during World War II. For example, thousands of young Japanese American men joined the U.S. Army forces. Even though many had families in internment camps, the Japanese American soldiers fought bravely for the United States. The United States government had officially apologized for its wartime treatment of the Japanese Americans. So I want you to consider for a second. We heard the main idea of that paragraph was, today we recognize that interning Japanese Americans was unfair. Why do you think the author makes that claim, that interning, or in this case, putting all of our Japanese Americans in one location away from their homes and away from the lives that they knew? Why do you think the author claims that this was unfair? So pause now if you need to. And you may also go back to an earlier portion of the video to relearn the information and think about why the author is saying that this was unfair. The American colonists that Miss Hirata's class was studying fought a war for independence from Britain. After the war, their leaders wrote in the Constitution a list of rights held by all citizens of the United States. One of those rights is the right to a fair trial before being imprisoned. Miss Arata's students were American citizens. They had never been put on trial, but they were imprisoned in the camp. Their constitutional rights had been violated. Still, the students loved their country and worked hard studying its history. They busily stitched the small patches of cloth for their colonial quilt. Miss Harada's lessons were always interesting, always fun. What would their names look like spread across a large quilt? Finally, the patches were finished. Miss Harada sewed them together. The quilt showing the names of all the fourth graders was proudly hung on the classroom wall. Many years later, when the war was long over and the students in Miss Arata's class were parents and grandparents themselves, they would see the quilt again. It had become part of a traveling exhibit for the Smithsonian Institution, the most famous museum in America. The quilt traveled to cities across the United States where it was seen by thousands of people. Miss Arata's class had made the quilt in order to learn about the colonial period in the United States history. Now the quilt was helping teach others about another chapter in United States history, World War II, and the difficult experience of Japanese Americans in that era. Miss Harada's former students felt proud to see their history project had itself become part of American history.